You are listening to From the Sea, a podcast series produced by South China Sea Studies. This program provides valuable insights from experts from around the world on geopolitical and security developments, with regard to the South China Sea as an area in a connected maritime landscape. In today's episode, Dr. Beck Stratting, Director of the La Trobe Center for Global Security at La Trobe University, will discuss with our host about the Australia's position on the South China Sea.
Well, hello, welcome back to another episode of From the Seas. Today, our very special guest, all the way from Australia, is Dr. Beck Stratting. Thank you for accepting our invitation and sharing a couple of minutes with us.
It's my pleasure to be on the pod. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you so much. So, our topic today is the Australia positions in the South China Sea, or maybe not official Australia positions, but from your perspective, how would Australia would engage in the South China Sea in a case of conflict?
Yes. Okay.
So I think you made a hot take in 2024 in one of your interview and one of your commentary, right, where you say that from Australia's point of view, the South China Sea seems to be a maritime body that is more prone to armed conflict rather than Taiwan. Do you still stand by that hot take in 2025?
That's not my memory of quite the take that I was going for. And I think there may have been a headline that was not written by me involved in that. And it's not Australia's position. My point that I was trying to make was actually that Australia tends to concentrate its attention on Taiwan as being the flashpoint that is most likely to lead to great power conflict. And so what that does in the general sort of public debate is concentrate the minds on the Taiwan contingency question. What would Australia do if great power conflict was to break out over Taiwan? My point was that by focusing all of that attention on Taiwan, we're missing other potential areas where conflict could break out. And the South China Sea is one area. This is of concern to Australia. Australia is very conscious of the South China Sea as being important to regional security and regional stability. But in our kind of general public conversations, we don't talk about a South China Sea contingency, or we don't talk about really what Australia would do in the event that conflict breaks out, and it's around the South China Sea rather than Taiwan. Taiwan is probably still the most likely area that conflict might break out between the great powers, but that the dynamics of the South China Sea are increasingly concerning, and so that discussion needs to be had.
And do you think that discussions, because of such necessity, do you think Australian scholars have been putting forward or advocated for more strategic attention on the South China Sea contingency scenario? And do you think Australian policymakers have been welcoming it receptively?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's no shortage of discussion about why the South China Sea matters for Australia. There are a lot of, good reasons. The first are that idea of regional security and stability, and ensuring that there is, a peaceful maritime region more generally in East Asia. The second is, it's a key trading route that Australia wants to see it and other trading routes remain open and free. But I would say that, and I've argued this before, that probably one of the most important thing is this idea of maintaining a norm-based order that is centred around UNCLOS and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, because this underscores Australia's own security and ability to trade and, its maritime zones and rights and responsibilities and so on. I mean, Australia has the world's third largest exclusive economic zone, and we have it because of UNCLOS, right? So I think we understand why the South China Sea matters. It's also often the South China Sea is used as a symbol or a kind of totemic device to talk about China's revisionism and to talk about China and the US strategic competition. So it's it's shorthand. The South China Sea is used as evidence that China wants to revise the international rules-based order. So that's a very dominant theme, not just in Australian discourses, but more generally in the West. But what I don't think we see much of is what actually happens if a conflict between the United States and China breaks out. So, I mean, that's a question. We heard a lot today about red lines and what might provoke initiation of a mutual defence treaty agreement between the United States and the Philippines. So there are those conversations that are being had, but if, something does happen, there seems to be tabletop exercises and things going on around Taiwan, but I'm not sure that there's many going on in terms of the South China Sea. Maybe there are things that are going on that I don't know about, but at least in the public discussion, that's not where the discussion or the debate about the South China Sea is at the moment, and it is a contrast to Taiwan. And one of the more problematic aspects of that is that the flashpoints remain pretty siloed. So you talk about Taiwan, but that if something does go on in Taiwan, it's going to have spill-out effects in other maritime areas. These are connected theatres. They aren't separate in the ways that they tend to be treated in the public imagination. I mean, even describing them as flashpoints is problematic in a lot of ways. Taiwan is more than just a flashpoint. It's a political entity with nearly as many people as Australia has, but treating these areas as distinct might have some ramifications.
So I'm glad that you touch upon the overarching themes of the rule of laws and UNCLOS, law of the sea, that is related to all of those flashpoints. Recently, we've seen Japan coming out with a one theater concept, which is quite similar to what you just mentioned before, which is also like an idea of connecting different maritime hotspots together under one arc. But then you also hear opinions about how having such security nexus being a little bit maybe dangerous, maybe unhelpful. So do you feel like having it under one single umbrella like that, do you feel like it's a helpful way to raise strategic awareness on the South China Sea, or do you feel like it will lead to maybe potentially more disruptions?
I think it is helpful. And I think it is also very reflective of the maritime as a geography. Like, we don't treat it the same way as territory. These maritime spaces are interconnected and fluid, and we even talk about things in terms of one ocean rather than oceans. I think in some ways it reflects the geography that we talk about these areas as not distinct but as connected. But what I think might be helpful is actually mapping the interdependencies between these regions. So actually thinking about much more clearly how they are connected and the different ways that conflict in one area might spill into another area. I mean, we've heard about, for example, this idea of the domino effect, like if Taiwan were to go, then it would be Senkaku, Diao, and the other islands. But I think it might be useful, rather than just sort of saying we have this one theatre, or the other one that we hear is the Indo-Pacific Atlantic concept, saying that the Indo-Pacific isn't separated from the Atlantic. But that's, I mean, I think there are reasonable views, but actually being able to map the relationships across them and where they matter the most is important, because let's face it, a middle power like Australia needs to be able to dedicate its resources in a targeted way. It can't just be like the whole of the Indo-Pacific Atlantic. And so if we're going to have these more less regional but more integrated regional approaches, then I think we need to have a clear idea about what is prioritised in that.
And you talked about how Australia might engage in contingencies in Taiwan earlier, right? And then there have been some war games related to that. I had this feeling that, war game simulations seems to be like a new kids in town.
Yes.
It's getting popular.
There's a lot going on.
But then I think most of the games focus on the war scenario and not on how to prevent the war from the first place from happening scenario. Do you feel like Australia is engaging in a way that is preparing for the war game conflict, or is it gravitating toward a conflict prevention directions?
Well, definitely Australia is interested in conflict prevention in Southeast Asia and more broadly, but Australia's participation in ASEAN-centred mechanisms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit is increasingly being influenced by Australia's conflict prevention agenda And in fact, there was a leader statement that was released recently during or after the ASEAN Summit on Conflict Prevention. And that is something that Australia is very enthusiastically hoping to promote in Southeast Asia and beyond, recognising that, in particular, conflict between great powers is the most consequential. So all states, including the great powers, and recognising that the maritime is a kind of dominant theatre in which that is likely to play out. So some colleagues and I recently wrote a paper. So Rory Metcalf, Huang Li Tu and I, we wrote a paper on conflict prevention and options for Australian statecraft, which was very much centred on this question of how can Australia and other partners in the region develop kind of more creative options for avoiding conflict before it begins, through preventive diplomacy, through crisis management mechanisms. And so that was actually commissioned by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. That is just part of the work Australia is doing. I think it's important work because it's about making sure that smaller and middle powers in the region have agency, because it's easy, I think, to be fatalistic about this and just be like, well, if you want to prevent great power conflict, that's up to the great powers. Like, heard that before. But smaller and middle powers and the institutions that they create have the ability to shape an environment and to try at least to encourage channels for communication and dialogue, of information sharing, of risk warning and reduction, that will hopefully enable an environment where crisis doesn't automatically turn into conflict.
Well, you talked about preventive diplomacies, one of the directions that Australia is going for. But what would you say to opinion that says, oh, but it seems like Australia seems to be engaging in the Sultancy in a different way?
It's
For
a
example,
really good point.
On the ground, they would be pointing out, oh, Australia is now more active in exercises.
Exactly.
Especially with the, what's this called, maritime cooperative activities, the MCAs, which is also getting hugely popular with the US and the Philippines. And it feels like Australia is also more active and more public with the freedom of navigation patrol idea now, right? And I'm aware that in the past, Australia was a little bit less open to, the so-called phone up offered from the United States.
Still doesn't do them in that way.
Right. But this year, Australia did one public one with the UK. If I'm not mistaken.
Don't think that was a freedom of navigation operation in a US style, though.
Not in the same name,
No.
but it functions as the same sort of, we're here to promote freedom of navigation.
So I'll just clarify
control.
that. This is what Australia would say is business as usual. Australia has always done freedom of navigation, and its presence, and it's not a US style follow-up is its own thing. And Australia tends to stay away from the most contested parts of the South China Sea, unlike the United States. So Australia has increased the tempo of transits, and we know that lots of countries now are transiting in areas to try to defend freedom of navigation rights. So there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that there's an increase in exercises. Again, they're designed, in part to try to defend international law of the sea and rights around freedom of navigation. But in terms of a conflict prevention agenda, Australian officials would probably argue that deterrence is part of a conflict prevention agenda. It's not the only part, but all countries in essence are building up their naval capabilities or going through patches of modernisation, and so there's no reason why in that atmosphere Australia wouldn't also be engaging in developing naval capabilities. The key thing that Australian officials would point out is that Australia is doing this in a much more transparent way than some other actors in the region. So you have deterrence, but you also have to couple that with reassurance. And I think we've seen a lot of work being done, for example, from Australian diplomats and officials in explaining AUKUS to the region. And that's part of that recognition that in building partnerships and building relationships in defence, that it's not, it can create a kind of uncertain environment, but it always needs to be coupled with other forms of statecraft that seek to reduce risk and to seek to have dialogue and exchange of ideas to try to reduce, mistrust to the extent that that is possible.
Can I challenge you a little bit on the
Sure.
point that you said about transparency?
Yeah.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, when the UK and Australia conducted that patrol in the South China Sea a few months ago, right? I think it was the UK who sort of came out publicly with the information. And I think the officials, Australian media standpoint was to stay silent.
I don't know enough about that
Yeah.
to comment, but certainly I know that Australian officials, as I said, like to point out that in a general sense, Australia is trying to be transparent about its capabilities, its interests, its policies. It released a Defence Strategic Review in 2023. It released a National Defence Strategy in 2024. There are always limits in transparency when it comes to defence, so it's never going to be 100%. And I think that there are still some lingering concerns over the way that AUKUS was announced in 2021, because that was not very transparent. But there is a clear direction, I think, from the current government in trying to be open and forthright with some of these issues. And that's the message that at least the Australian government is seeking to get across, that there is a big difference in the transparency of actors.
For a little bit gloomy questions. So what if that scenario that we all want to avoid happen in the South China Sea? How would you see Australia react?
Wow, it's a really good question. I mean, this is why I raised it in the article, is because I'm not entirely sure. I mean, my general sense at this stage, and it's hard to know because there's so many uncertainties at the moment, but I mean, Australia has been a pretty reliable ally of the United States historically. And it would depend on what's being asked, it would depend on the requirements, it would depend on all sorts of scenarios. But it's hard for me to conceptualise that if the United States asks for Australia's assistance, given the historical trajectory, I think we've been in every conflict with the United States except Grenada since, the signing, since World War II. So historically, I think it suggests that Australia is quite keen to stand alongside the United States. It's a bit of an insurance premium logic there. The hope that if Australia is threatened, that the US would return the favour and come to Australia's aid. But that having been said, there's a lot. I mean, the current, in 2025, the current environment is makes it difficult, I think, to use history as a guide, if that makes sense. Things are happening that I would not have expected, and so I think we need to take that with a grain of salt. And I don't think that, I mean, it's a bit like, having that Australia has a position of strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan issue. So, making a prediction is not the same as saying Australia has a policy on this, because, obviously decision makers at the time will adjudicate the circumstances as they fall.
But I think a lot of people would agree with you on the point that, 2025 is different from what happened in history, right? And then also one of the points that you mentioned earlier is that middle powers also have agency. Yes, we're not passive players, and we can exert our own influence. It's not just up to the major power who gets to decide, but we do have a voice in this, and we can spread that influence and maybe in a way create like a bottom-up approach. And I think they also need to listen to us if they want to be a responsible stakeholder in the South China Seas.
And I think that the great powers spend a lot of time thinking about strategic narratives and about winning arguments and about promoting particular viewpoints, whether it's, in these sort of track 1.5 dialogues or whether it's through information campaigns that are directed towards the general public, whether it's in their own countries or the countries of others, because great powers also care about legitimacy.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing with China is not this grand revision of the international rules. It's a selective approach. It is exceptionalism. And the question for me is, at what point does rule breaking actually threaten maritime order generally? And what I mean by that is, countries, the US takes an exceptional approach to international law, and yet international order has sort of continued, and the liberal international order continued to flourish, even though you had a great power that wasn't signing itself up to all of the rules, even the ones that it helped create. So the question for me, in my mind, then, is, as an emerging great power, China would like, the sorts of rights that come with being a great power. And that includes, unfortunately, being able to exempt themselves from bits of international law. But my question, that I don't have an answer to, but I think is really important, is how much exceptionalism can the order handle before it falls apart, before it stops ordering?
Right, but as you said, is that yes, big powers, they also need legitimacy, they also need reputations. The fact that they are still signaling and reaching out to ASEAN or middle powers or regional players, indicating that they still care about those values. So maybe, that will also be the end of the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much.
But before we let you go, it's a tradition to do like a pop cultural thing.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm terrible with pop culture.
Right, I don't know. Wow. What have you been listening to?
I'll try and think of something more current.
Australian? In
I
excess,
tell you,
maybe?
In excess, like Australian songs of all time. There was this poll. So Australians voted Never Tear Us Apart. It's the best Australian song in history.
This is the end of this episode. Stay tuned for our upcoming discussion, which will be released on Spotify and Apple Podcast, as well as Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Thank you for listening.
Don't ask me what you know is true. Don't have to tell you I love your precious heart. I was standing, you were there, two worlds collided.